As we move now from the fundamental structure of the central metaphysical concept, the ultimate truth of thought and consciousness developing in this reciprocal relation with objects, this incorporative relation, we've been led to the question, what characterizes now the movement that is enabled by spirit or Geist? How does this mind develop? What is the nature of its development? And this leads us to what is the most well-known feature in Hegel's system, the triadic relations of affirmation, negation, and synthesis. And so earlier I said that Hegel is dialectical. And the nature of that dialectic is, one, an affirmation or a thesis, two, a negation, and three, a synthesis. The dialectical pattern for the development of Geist through time is a threefold movement of affirmation, negation, and synthesis. W.T. Jones speaks of, quote, the system as a whole as a triadic pattern. And so the dialectic here, the dialectical movement, is a triadic pattern. That's absolutely critical to grasp. The triadic system then consists in a series of dialectical relations comprised of affirmation, negation, and synthesis, or thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And this leads to a series of triadic movements that characterize Hegel's developing conception of the absolute. The more popular way of putting this, the way that it's put in many introductory philosophical textbooks, is that there is a thesis, affirmation, that generates an antithesis, its negation, and that this movement drives directly to synthesis. This might be easier to remember. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now, here's the key to remember. Hegel believes that there is absolute truth, and he believes that absolute truth is developing. And because of that, for Hegel, an antithesis is not bad. An antithesis is not harmful. An antithesis is not to be feared, because what an antithesis does is enables a refinement of the original thesis as the two, the affirmation and negation, the thesis and antithesis, are incorporated in a higher level of thought, of synthesis, in a higher level of spirit reaching self-consciousness. The dynamic nature of Geist, remember, if you can still see the spirit here of Geist, the dynamic nature of Geist is that a thesis generates its own antithesis, which in turn is reconciled in a synthesis. And this process continues until the arrival at the end of the historical and dialectical process when spirit becomes completely self-conscious and entirely determinate. The end of the process. The movements as they inexorably advance toward an omega point is a state of affairs in which every universal truth is expressed in every concrete particular, and every concrete particular is contained in the universal truth. Spirit is the ultimate perfect integration of thought and content, what Hegel called that monism of absolute spirit. Now, thought and content advances toward absolute truth through what Hegel calls a process of negation. And the process of negation is this dialectical triadic pattern. All truth advances through thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Let me give you a very basic example. W.T. Jones, page 125, Kant in the 19th century, says, quote, "Every assertion that color is red is negated by some other assertion, no, it is blue, and these two are then reconciled in a third assertion, rather, it is royal purple. The thesis, the color is red. The antithesis, the color is blue. The synthesis, the color is royal purple." Now, assuming that the object is royal purple, assuming that when we get to a synthesis and we conclude that an object is royal purple, what was the case about the affirmation and the negation? They were imprecise and inadequate to experience. The thesis that the color is red was imprecise. It was one-sided. It was looking at the features in the object that appeared to have a reddish hue. The antithesis, the color is blue, was likewise impartial and inadequate. The synthesis, therefore, royal purple, is more adequate to the object. Hegel's point is that Geist develops in this way. Every thesis expresses only a partial developmental truth, and listen, it carries the seeds of its own dissolution within itself. If you find a color that's royal purple and you affirm that it is red instead, that oversimple partial truth will wind up negating itself. Someone will say, it's not red, it looks more blue. And then the antithesis also has the seeds of its own dissolution built into it, so that all partial affirmations are always moving toward a synthetic resolution, a higher synthesis, a fuller, more adequate rendering of experience. This is the internal character of Geist. It is thought, listen, constantly developing greater universality and greater particularity, greater breadth and greater detail, as there is an historical process of affirmation, negation, and synthesis. All of reality, listen, all of reality is developing in this triadic pattern. Whether it's the simple illustration, the color is red, no, the color is blue, no, the color is royal purple, synthesis, or whether it's more involved. In fact, if Hegel were here, he would probably use the structure of my lecture as evidence supporting his claim. What did I begin with? I began with thought, because Hegel does, mind as the central metaphysical concept, as the ultimate truth. But then we presented thought as what? Well, it's not a static and ultimate reality. It's a dynamic reality reciprocally related to objects. We had to be more precise. We had to be more detailed. So it's not just generic, abstract, static thought. It's thought that develops through time. But we then introduced that the truth is in the whole, and so every partial movement where mind departs to objects and brings those objects back incorporated into itself, every movement of Geist, every dialectical advancement is what? An advancement of partial truth moving toward the whole. And then we expressed how truth advances through a triadic process, a dialect of affirmation, negation, and synthesis. The whole lecture has been moving from an original thesis about mind to what might appear to be its negation. It's not ultimate truth, it's partial and developmental. And then what does Hegel say about it? About mind that develops? Well, it's developing toward absolute truth. So the whole structure of this lecture, Hegel would say, is a good illustration of the outworking of Geist. Remember, Hegel is a rationalist, and he believes that through this dialectic, absolute truth in absolute spirit will emerge at the end of the process. Therefore, for every assertion until that omega point is reached, every assertion carries the seeds of its dissolution within it, thesis, generates a negation, antithesis, that yields a more adequate and precise synthesis. This is the inexorable process of Geist. And the more comprehensive the view, the more universal it is, the more detailed the statement, the more concrete it is, and the synthesis brings a greater universality and a greater particularity, and this is the dialectical triadic process by which the absolute gains self-consciousness, moving toward the omega point of full self-consciousness. Now, by way of just preview here, I want you to appreciate that for Hegel, this movement of thesis, synthesis, and antithesis is moving toward what Hegel will call a concrete universal. I'm not going to define that in detail yet, but simply note this, that minds and objects in their reciprocal relation are gaining greater universality, greater particularity, moving toward the perfect synthetic relation between universals and particulars in a final arrival at what Hegel called absolute spirit. It's there that all partial truths are reconciled in ultimate truth. And so Hegel does have a terminal point, and he calls it a concrete universal, an all-inclusive resolution of idea and nature, of mind and objects, and it is his eschatology. Now, this is the basic material that I want you to grasp. What I want to do now, and give you by way of addition, is just a sense and taste of Hegel's dialectic. I took a course with Greg Bahnsen back in 1991 on Hegel. And I was living in Austin, Texas, soon to be in Austin, Texas. We got there in 93 when I married my wife. And Bahnsen made this observation I want to make now. If you stop right here, you have the core of Hegel's philosophy. You don't have the whole system, but you have spirit as the grandest conception of all, the developmental mind, the mutual change involved in both, and the fact that spirit accounts for this process and is moving toward absolute rationality and absolute truth at the end of a process where there's an ultimate comprehensive synthesis. Now, what I want to do is just walk you through, and I want this to be illustrative and brief. There is no way that we can do a fully adequate exposition of Hegel, even in the time we have. But I want to look at the triads that Hegel proposes. I'm following Bahnsen and W.T. Jones on this. And there are three main triads that Hegel proposed. And I want to give them to you by an appeal to this small portion here on the board and give you just a sense of what Hegel is saying. I'm not going to expound it too deeply, but I want you to appreciate it. For Hegel, the first main triadic expression of spirit is found in being, nothing, and becoming. Being, nothing, and becoming. Being, for Hegel, is the most basic thing that can be predicated about something. That it is. But when we make the statement that something is, this does not give us anything particular or specific. There's nothing determinate about saying that something is. Simply to say that something has being does not differentiate it from other things that have being. There's just nothing determinate or concrete about it. And in that sense, Hegel says being leads to its negation, which is nothing. To say that something is nothing is to negate that it exists. It is to say that existence cannot be applied to it. It is the pure negation of being. So to say something has being is to say that it is. To say that something is nothing is to say it is not. And this, I don't want to go too far with this, but Hegel would also say that there's not much difference between conceiving of being and non-being. Neither is determinate. So what do we have to have in order to have conceptual adequacy? We have to say that what is not finds a resolution in what is becoming. Because becoming, now listen, this is abstract, but listen, becoming is a synthetic resolution of what is and is not. Let me try to explain that. If something is in the process of becoming, it is the synthesis of what is and is not in a process of increasingly determinate existence. When something is in the process of becoming, it both exists, yet it is developing into something that it's not. Being and nothing are resolved in a process where being develops into something it's not. And you say, give me an illustration. We've already used one. Let me give you an illustration. When you have a seed that is planted, you have a thesis. But when that seed is negated, when the seed disappears, when the seed is negated and is no longer a seed, it is no longer seed. What happens? It becomes a blossom. It evolves into a blossom. Does it continue to exist? Yes. Does it continue to exist as a seed? No, it's been negated. But what does it become? It becomes a blossom. The seed gives way to a bud that negates the seed form. The bud gives way to a blossom that is the what? The synthesis of the being of the seed, its negation in a bud, and the blossom is the fruition of the seed being negated, the seed as bud, the seed gives way from bud to blossom. So in the first triad, you begin with what exists. Nothingness is the negation of its existence in that indeterminate form. And becoming is the making more concrete of that developmental form of existence. Now, that's the general notion. Hegel says there's a second main triad: being, essence, and notion. Being, nothing, becoming, being, essence, and notion. So he uses being again, essence, and notion. And this will be a little more concrete for you, I think. Being, essence, and notion are the second main triad in the way that Hegel expresses the outworking of Geist. Now these are terms that Hegel uses in a unique way. I don't think you can find these used precisely this way outside of Hegel. But being represents the naive and immediate way of encountering experience from the outside. It's what we might call a spectator approach of describing objects in our experience. We think of reality as accessible objects that we know with certainty. We know these without any conceptual mediation or rational process of reflection. This would just be, in one sense, naive experience, being. Essence, as an antithesis, involves entering into being and gaining an understanding of being from within, drawing distinctions from within it. Essence involves gaining and understanding being through concepts that arise in it. So having the knowledge of something in terms of being is an external knowledge. It's thought, it's minds encountering objects at a distance. Essence is the mind entering into the object, encountering it from within, and gaining a more adequate conceptual grasp of that object from within itself. Remember, Hegel speaks of minds departing and entering into objects, and then returning those objects to itself in incorporation. Being, knowledge at a distance. Essence, knowledge internal to the object. And then what? Notion. Being is objects outside understood naively. Essence is entering into the objects and understanding them in terms of the concepts that are in them. Notion is what? The integration of being and essence. Notion is the integrative instant that thought and objects are joined together in resolution. Thesis, being, external knowledge. Negation, essence, internal knowledge, entering into the object itself. Notion, the integration of the two in a movement that transcends the earlier form of naive knowledge and being, the more developed form of notion, conceptual grasp from inside the object. Notion is the return. Now, W.T. Jones, if that's abstract, and it is, W.T. Jones gives an illustration that I think might be helpful. Illustration of being. Think of a high school graduate applying for college. He expects to be admitted to college based on his own estimate of his abilities, without having even supplied a required document for entrance, a GRE, a social security number, a transcript, or reference. This is the bare appearance of being a surface-level, naive conception of entering college. That is being. That is an unsophisticated external conception of how you enter college. Essence. The dean of admissions believes that the student should be admitted only if he gets a certain score on his GRE. Even if he has properly submitted all of his other documents, he appeals to an objective standard beyond the student's own naive assessment of himself and is more sophisticated. He distinguishes between appearance and detachment, the student's own assessment of himself and reality, the GRE score. He's being more sophisticated. But what about notion? How do you reconcile the student's assessment and the dean's assessment? Well, the dean does not realize that the GRE score is only a partial truth, a partial assessment of how a student might function. The GRE needs to be viewed not as an absolute, but as one instrument along with the student's own strengths and self-assessment for entering into college. This is the level of notion. This is an integrative movement that takes what is partial and fragmentary from the student and the dean and resolves them in a higher, more adequate synthetic movement. Notion is more adequate as it realizes the refinement needed in being, student self-assessment, and dean, narrow self-assessment. Each movement is an ascending of self-consciousness in relation to objects that is more adequate. The student is myopic, occupied with self. The dean is a bit broader, occupied with objective scores. There needs to be a synthesis between them that includes what is true in each, yet moves beyond the limitations in each. It may be that the student's GRE score is not the best, but he's a straight A student, president of the class, and has a whole host of other things that the GRE cannot capture for admission. Now, that's a low-level illustration of something Hegel's actually trying to say that's more abstract. But here's what I want you to appreciate. Hegel is saying that whether we talk about the color red, the color blue, or royal purple, or whether we talk about the student, the dean, and the inadequacies of both moving toward his entrance into college, all of reality is developing in these triadic patterns, and we should not fear the negation of a thesis. Now, the final triad, and I actually think this one might make the most sense because it's going to be more on the level of how we began. Hegel said there's a final synthesis between idea, this is the big one, I'm going to put them all in caps, idea on the one side, nature, and spirit. Idea, nature, and spirit. Now, this is the grandest of all the syntheses, and in my opinion, this will probably make the most sense to you in light of the way that we've given the core of what Hegel's saying. Idea is thought understood as consciousness itself. On our board here, think of thought simpliciter, pure consciousness. Just for the sake of argument, existing apart from content, which we know Hegel says it can't because the relation to content's reciprocal. But idea is pure consciousness. It is thought understood as consciousness itself. That is the affirmation. What is the affirmation? What got Hegel's whole system started? Mind or thought is the central metaphysical concept. It is ultimate truth. Nature is understood as objects for consciousness itself. So these finite objects we can call nature. Now, it is the negation of consciousness because objects outside the mind are not objects outside the mind. Lecterns, cameras are not conscious. Spirit, as we've seen, spirit is the integration of thought, the synthesis of thought and objects. Spirit is the resolution of idea and nature. Spirit is the synthetic resolution of idea and nature, beyond which there are no higher resolutions. Now, in all ways, we're going to say we're oversimplifying what Hegel is after. But let me just put it this way. In the final synthetic movement, when absolute spirit is reached, when there is a final synthesis of idea and nature at the omega point of history, thought will think of itself as distinct from nature, yet will have incorporated nature perfectly into its consciousness. In a final synthetic movement where thought thinks itself, knows itself as other, as object. When that occurs, Hegel said we will reach the concrete universal. Absolute spirit, in a final synthetic movement, will integrate consciousness of all objects into a final, totalizing consciousness of every single object in a perfect and exhaustive relation that Hegel called the concrete universal. There will be no universal excluded from consciousness. There will be no particular excluded from consciousness. In absolute spirit, all polarities are ultimately resolved as thought thinks itself, along with all universals and particulars, including them all, in a single act of self-consciousness. Now, when that happens, Greg Bahnsen made clear, as Hegel did, that all particular self-consciousness evaporates. When the concrete universal is realized, you won't know it. There will no longer be an individual who remains finite and conscious of himself as distinct or separate from others. The finite, infinite distinction is overcome in the absolute. Eternity and time, unity and diversity, simplicity and composition are overcome in the final synthetic movement of what Hegel called the monism of absolute spirit. Hegel's rationalism is monistic. No creator-creature distinction remains. All universals and particulars, all that is absolute and relative is integrated in what Hegel called, in the final movement, absolute spirit. Now, just in light of this, I think you can see that the developmental absolute of Hegel undermines once and for all a creator-creature distinction maintained in a creator-creature relation. What Hegel posits overcomes that absolute ontological distinction maintained at every point in the relation between the creator and the creature. And what is so disturbing about Hegel, which we're going to move on to discuss now, is that he used the doctrine of Christ as an illustration of the movement toward the evisceration of the creator-creature distinction and made Christ one middle point phase, one incremental phase in the evisceration of the creator-creature distinction as reality moves toward absolute spirit. And we'll turn to consider Hegel's pantheistic doctrine of Jesus Christ as the religious middle point of his system as a whole.